It was April of 2015. I was a college student and my little brother Leo was 9. My two girlfriends, Scarlett and Chloe, and I had decided to take advantage of a midweek special at our local theater, the Grandview Cinema, to see the horror film It Follows. We were all looking forward to it. The Grandview was one of those old rundown local spots, maybe 4 screens total, that smelled perpetually of stale popcorn and cheap cleaner. It felt comfortably antiquated, and we often found ourselves with an entire theater to ourselves for the late shows. When we stepped into the theater, the house lights were already dimmed. For a moment it seemed like we were the only ones there. But then Leo, my little brother, who has always had a strange, almost unsettlingly calm observation for his age, pointed upward. "Look," he whispered, his voice thin in the large, dark space. Top left. It was a man in a dark gray hoodie, pulled tight over his head, sitting in the very top row, completely against the left wall. He was absolutely still. For us, it was a little sketchy, a solitary figure alone in the dark. But ultimately, we dismissed it as a weird guy who got there first. We took seats in an upper middle row, about 6 rows from the back, deliberately leaving a full empty seat between each of us for extra room and comfort. Scarlett, always the skeptic, immediately pulled out her phone to text her boyfriend, dismissing the man with a slight eye roll. Chloe, the overreactor, fiddled nervously with her purse, glancing frequently at the far corner. Leo, the calm thinker, settled in, munching his Sour Patch Kids, occasionally looking up at the static silhouette. "He's not even looking at the screen," Leo noted after about 5 minutes of previews. I shushed him, but the comment lodged itself in my mind. Even in the gloom, with the screen light reflecting, the man seemed to be facing forward toward the screen, but somehow not at it. He was a static, unnatural silhouette. The lights finally dropped completely, and the film began. It Follows is a profoundly unsettling film because it preys on the psychological dread of being constantly, slowly, relentlessly watched and pursued. It's the fear of knowing that something is always coming for you. Naturally, the atmosphere of the movie amplified our existing paranoia. About 20 minutes into the film, something moved. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. The hoodie man in the top left corner was gone. I nudged Scarlett. "Did you see him leave?" Scarlett, immersed in the film, shook her head. "No." "Shh." I waited, trying to rationalize it. "He went to the bathroom. He'll be back." But the empty corner felt like a sudden cold hole in the darkness. A few minutes later, I saw him again. He had moved to the opposite side of the theater. He was now in the top right corner in the exact mirror image seat. He was sitting with the same unnerving stillness, the hoodie pulled up, his posture rigid. This time, I was genuinely rattled. Why would anyone move, especially to an identical seat across the entire theater? I leaned forward and whispered to Leo, "Did you see him move?" Leo nodded once, eyes still on the screen. "Yeah, he looked like he was crawling down the aisle at first. Super slow. Then he went up the other side." His calm, matter-of-fact observation was worse than any panic. Chloe, the overreactor, was already whispering, "He's still not watching the movie. He's looking down." She was right. For the next 45 minutes, our focus shifted entirely from the movie to the silent, static presence in the top right corner. The psychological tension the film was creating, the feeling of an unseen presence closing in, was now being terrifyingly mirrored in our reality. The first major twist came about halfway through the film. The main character finally gets cornered by the entity. The theater was dead silent, the sound design emphasizing the strained breathing and the slow, deliberate footsteps of the approaching figure on screen. It was in that exact moment of absolute tension on the screen that the man in the corner moved again. He stood up completely, but with an economy of movement that was unnatural. He didn't unhunch or stretch. He simply straightened. And then he began to descend the stairs, in the aisle. He was coming down the aisle toward us. In that big dark space, the sound of his footsteps was completely drowned out by the movie's score and the frantic beat of our collective heartbeats. But we could see him, a tall, bulky shadow of a man in a gray hoodie, descending slowly, deliberately between the rows of empty seats. He passed the aisle leading to the exit doors. He wasn't walking quickly, and he wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at the empty seats, methodically scanning them. We were frozen. Scarlett's skepticism had vanished. Chloe was breathing in sharp, shallow gasps. Leo had stopped chewing his candy. It was impossible to know what his intention was, but in that moment it felt purely predatory. He reached the row directly in front of us, the row with the railing we had our feet up on. He stood there for a long time, maybe 20 seconds. He was close enough now that I could make out details in the reflected light. the slight dampness of his jeans, the dark material of the hood covering his face completely. He smelled faintly of ozone, and something metallic, like old pennies. Then he turned slightly, and instead of walking across the row or continuing down the aisle, he just stepped up onto the railing in front of us. He stood there balancing perfectly, his back to the screen facing us. It was the most terrifying moment of stillness I have ever experienced. 4 people petrified and exposed, staring up at a man who was now openly, completely watching them instead of the movie. And then he raised a hand. Slowly, deliberately. He pointed not at any one of us, but directly at the empty seat between me and Scarlett. The empty seat we had left for space, the seat that was a comfortable void. He held the point unmoving until the movie suddenly cut to a loud, piercing scream, jolting all of us out of our paralysis. "We're leaving." Now I hissed, scrambling out of my seat, pulling Leo up by the arm. The man didn't move as we clambered over our seats and sprinted up the nearest aisle, a frantic blur of panic and adrenaline. We didn't look back until we burst through the main double doors and into the bright, safe corridor outside. We stood there for a solid minute, waiting for the security door to swing open and for the gray hoodie to follow us out. But he didn't. He was pointing at the empty seat, Leo said, quietly looking down at his spilled candy bag. Why, the empty seat. The empty seat. The space we left. The space between us. We ran to the car and sped out of the theater parking lot. We drove for 10 minutes, mostly in silence. As we reached the main highway, I glanced in my rearview mirror one last time before merging into traffic. That's when I saw him. The Grandview Cinema was maybe a mile back, but the parking lot was visible from the top of the hill we were cresting. I saw a single tall figure standing motionless at the edge of the asphalt near the main road sign, illuminated faintly by the lot lights. It was the gray hoodie, and he wasn't standing facing the road or the building or his car. He was facing the highway, his head slightly tilted, and he was raising one hand. He was waving. Not a friendly, casual wave, but a slow, sweeping motion, like a coach signaling a play. And in that moment in the dark mirror, it looked exactly like he was waving goodbye to someone specific. Someone who wasn't in the car, but someone else. The fear hit me with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just a creepy guy in a movie theater. He had been waiting. And he was marking our exit. The 20-minute drive home was a fog of hypervigilance. Scarlett the skeptic kept trying to find a mundane explanation. He was probably just a theater employee. The waving, a coincidence. But her voice was tight. Leo, the calm thinker, kept repeating the question. Why the empty seat, though? Why not one of us? The empty seat. The void. 2 days later, the unsettling feeling hadn't faded. I was constantly checking over my shoulder. It wasn't until I was cleaning out my little shoulder bag before going to class that I found the first piece of evidence that disproved the mundane explanation entirely. My theater ticket stub for the It Follows showing was still there, tucked in the side pocket. But right next to it was a second ticket stub. I stared at it. It was for the exact same movie, same date, same time, same theater, Theater 2, but it was for seat G13. My ticket was for G10. Scarlett was G8. Chloe was G6. Leo was G4. G13 was the seat that had been empty between me and Scarlett. The seat the man had pointed at. This second ticket was old-fashioned, thick cardstock, faded and slightly damp, looking like it had been in a wallet for years, a physical reserve ticket. Ours were print-at-home digital tickets. I hadn't bought a fifth ticket. We had just sat around it. It suddenly hit me the man hadn't pointed at the empty seat to mess with us. He had been indicating that the seat belonged to someone or was reserved for something. And somehow, while he was standing right in front of us facing us, he had managed to drop or plant this old ticket stub for that specific seat into my zipped-up bag, which had been resting on the floor beside my foot. He had been close enough, silent enough, and bold enough to plant this disturbing piece of information on me. A week after the incident, unable to shake the constant feeling of surveillance, I Googled the Grandview Cinema. I was hoping to find a news report or a Yelp thread about a creepy employee. What I found was a single cryptic 1-star review posted just 3 days earlier with the title Empty Seats. The review text was just 4 words: they left the space. It was written anonymously, but the photo attached to the review made my blood run cold. It was a close-up angled shot of our row taken from the extreme top right corner, the very seat where the man had been sitting the second time. The lens was focused right on the row's central feature, the small metallic railing and the 4 pairs of feet we had propped up on it. I could recognize all our shoes. But the focus of the shot wasn't our feet. It was the floor under the empty seat G13. And resting right there, half concealed by the shadow of the seat, was the small dark red stain of spilled liquid right next to a small glistening patch of crushed Sour Patch Kids Leo's candy. The photo captured the mundane litter of our panic. It was proof he had watched us sprint out and then went back inside to document the aftermath. Tucked right into the shadow on the edge of the seat, cushion itself, a tiny corner of white was visible. A note. I was shaking as I drove back to the Grandview Cinema. That very night, rational thought abandoned, replaced by a desperate need for closure. The Grandview Cinema was closed. The parking lot was empty. I tried the door to Theater 2, but it was locked. As I rattled the handle, I noticed a small, nearly invisible sliver of white wedged between the door frame and the edge of the door. It was the small folded piece of paper from the picture. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it. It was the note placed there for me to find a final cold transmission from the gray hoodie. The handwriting was clean block letters written in a heavy black pen. The lens was focused right on the row's central feature, the small metallic railing and the 4 pairs of feet we had propped up on it. I could recognize all our shoes. But the focus of the shot wasn't our feet. It was the floor under the empty seat G13. And resting right there, half concealed by the shadow of the seat, was the small dark red stain of spilled liquid right next to a small glistening patch of crushed Sour Patch Kids Leo's candy. The ticket for G13 wasn't a threat of ownership. It was a warning that the void had been reserved. The pointing wasn't a gesture of madness. It was a signpost telling us where the real danger lay. He wasn't the monster. He was the marker who pointed out the empty seat and then waited at the edge of the parking lot to signal to the entity from the film that the new recipient was on the move. I remembered looking in the rearview mirror and seeing the man waving at the highway. I had thought he was waving goodbye to me, the driver. But he had been facing the highway, waving a slow, deliberate wave. The movement was exactly like a man flagging down an oncoming taxi, or perhaps signaling a location to someone or something, following a much slower, more methodical path. The empty seat, the space we had left. The cold, heavy realization settled in somewhere out there, slowly, relentlessly. Something was walking toward the space I had left unfilled. The worst part of working the closing shift at the Northgate Megaplex wasn't the hours or the minimum wage. It was the crushing, absolute silence that settled in after midnight. It felt like all the human energy and noise from the day, the crowds, the laughter, the frantic dialogue on screen had been violently sucked out, leaving behind a cold, echoing shell. It was the summer of 2018, and I was a closing supervisor, which meant I was the last person out, usually around 2:30 a.m. The Megaplex was a 12-screen behemoth, and on a slow Tuesday night, my final security check traversing those vast dark auditoriums felt less like a job and more like exploring a derelict structure on an alien landscape. On this particular night, my final sector was Theater 5, one of the smaller houses usually reserved for indie films. The professional cleanup crew had finished and locked up about an hour earlier. My job was the final security sweep block, checks, power checks, and most crucially, making sure no one was lingering, perhaps asleep in a top corner or hiding for some illicit purpose. I walked down the main aisle, my heavy-duty company flashlight cutting a focused, dusty beam through the air. The silence felt heavy, like wet concrete settling. That's when I noticed the first anomaly. In the second-to-last row, tucked neatly into a cup holder, was a single old-fashioned movie ticket stub. This wasn't one of our modern thermal printouts. This was thick, creamy cardstock, the kind they used decades ago. It was for a film called Shadow Play, dated 1987. Theater 5 specifically. This was highly unusual. Theater 5 had been completely renovated in 2010. Any ticket stub from 1987 should have been vacuumed, scrubbed, or incinerated 1,000 times over. I picked it up. It felt cold and brittle, almost perfectly preserved. But then I saw the second thing. In the exact same row, the last seat on the left, there was a small spill on the floor. It was a single-serving tub of popcorn tipped over, a few dozen kernels scattered on the industrial carpet. This popcorn was not the stale, hardened kind that usually resists the vacuum cleaner. It was fresh, soft, like it had been made less than an hour ago. The last showing in Theater 5 had ended at 10:15 p.m. The cleanup crew was thorough, and there was absolutely no way they would have missed a fresh spill. There was also no way a customer would be eating popcorn 3 hours after the final screening. My heart started thumping a dull, uneven rhythm. The feeling of being watched, that cold technical surveillance, settled over me. I called my only other remaining coworker, David the Skeptic, who was in the distant Theater 11, over the walkie-talkie. "Hey, I'm in 5, I whispered into the static. It felt safer to whisper. "Did anyone re-enter this theater after the cleaning crew left?" David's voice crackled back, instantly annoyed. "No, man. The house is locked. I checked the back exit on my perimeter sweep. Probably a cleaner missed it. Just toss the popcorn and move on. You're holding up my closeout." David was the embodiment of the rule that no real horror can exist while there is a bureaucracy to uphold. I tossed the old ticket stub in my pocket, wiped up the popcorn, but I didn't move on. I was scanning the empty seats, seeing shadows where before there was just darkness. I felt compelled to look up toward the projection window. The tiny window set high up that allows the light to shoot out onto the screen. As I looked up, the light in the projection booth above me flickered on. It was a small incandescent bulb, a warm, sickly yellow light that cut the darkness with a sharp line. This was the ghost light, the small light left on in a dark, empty theater to prevent accidents. Protocol was to kill all unnecessary power before closing. This ghost light was not meant to be on. It stayed on for maybe 10 seconds. Then, just as suddenly, it went off. I took a deep, shaky breath, convincing myself it was a timer, a surge, a faulty wire. But the protocol-breaking light paired with the impossible ticket and the fresh popcorn made a single narrative click into place. I had to go up to the booth to check the circuit breaker anyway. The projection booth was accessed via a narrow steel staircase in the back staff hallway. I ascended the stairs, my boots thudding on the metal grate, the noise seeming impossibly loud in the silence. The door to the Theater 5 booth was solid steel with a push-bar handle. I tried the handle. It was locked. This was the first true alarm bell. Projection booths were never locked from the inside. They were secured with a lock and key when the last employee left, but the push bar on the inside had to remain functional for fire safety. The latch was clearly engaged, meaning someone or something had locked it after entering. I tried the handle again, rattling the steel door. "Hello, David. Is that you?" "Cut it out, man. I'm trying to leave." No response. Only the deafening silence of the closed theater. I pulled out my key ring and tried to unlock the door from the outside. The key slid in easily, but the tumbler didn't turn. The interior lock was overriding the exterior mechanism. I slammed my hand against the steel door in sheer frustration, a loud clang echoing down the hall. And then I heard the subtle sound of movement from inside the booth. A quiet thump, like a box being set down, or a chair being scraped. I retreated immediately, rushing back down the stairs and toward the manager's office, hoping to see the situation on the surveillance monitors. I tossed the old ticket stub in my pocket, wiped up the popcorn, but I didn't move on. I was scanning the empty seats, seeing shadows where before there was just darkness. I felt compelled to look up toward the projection window. The tiny window set high up that allows the light to shoot out onto the screen. As I looked up, the light in the projection booth above me flickered on. It was a small incandescent bulb, a warm, sickly yellow light that cut the darkness with a sharp line. The image was grainy, rendered in the pale green and black of the night vision mode. No movement, no person. I watched for a full minute, holding my breath. Nothing. I slumped back, the adrenaline draining away, leaving me exhausted and ashamed. It was a faulty lock, a bad wire, and my imagination running wild. I must have mistaken a creak for a person. I was letting the spooky movie environment get to me. I practically sprinted to the office, threw myself into the manager's chair, and pulled up the security feed. I quickly navigated to the cameras for Theater 5. I maximized the view. There was a camera pointing directly at the entrance to the projection booth stairs, and one inside the booth itself. I focused on the booth feed first. It showed the cramped room, the projector, the server, the small desk. Everything was still, unmoving. I prepared to leave the office, but just as I was standing up, I noticed something profoundly wrong with the live feed for Theater 5. It was subtle, but now that I was looking at it clinically, it was undeniable. The timestamp in the corner of the Theater 5 feeds, all 4 of them, was exactly 3 seconds behind the timestamps on every other feed in the grid. It's enough time for a person to step out of the shot, turn off a light, or open and close a door before the live video registers the change. It meant that for 3 seconds, whoever was inside the locked projection booth knew exactly what the camera was about to show me. They were controlling the narrative, deciding what I could and could not see. The true horror of it was the calculation involved. It wasn't a glitch. It was a purposeful hidden modification to the security system designed to make the camera useless for real-time observation. I was utterly alone and being played by a trapped predator. I went back to Theater 5 slower this time. When I reached the door, I pushed it open gently. I stepped inside. The air was cold, but something else had changed. The smell of stale popcorn was gone, replaced by a faint chemical scent like cheap ammonia. The smell of industrial cleaner. And then I heard it. The soft but distinct sound of someone unwrapping a cellophane candy wrapper. Crinkle, crinkle. It was coming from the center of the theater, somewhere in the upper rows. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, my eyes straining into the darkness, focusing on the source of the subtle sound. The unwrapping stopped. The silence returned. It was a deliberate, mocking silence, like a joke being withheld. And then a tiny red dot appeared high up in the center row. The glow of a cigarette ember held low. It was the soft, pulsing light of someone taking a casual, relaxed drag, watching the only entrance. I wasn't just trapped inside the theater with a stranger. I was trapped inside with an audience member who knew I was watching, who had delayed the security feed, and who was sitting in the dark waiting for the show to begin. The pulsing red ember of the cigarette was a beacon of complete casual confidence, a stark contrast to my own frozen panic. It belonged to someone who had planned this moment and was now simply waiting for the final act. As I stared, my breath fogging the small window in the door, the red ember suddenly moved. It arced slightly smoothly as the figure brought the cigarette down. Then a faint, almost imperceptible thwack sound reached me. The sound of a foot kicking something on the carpet. I heard the sound of the chair. It was a subtle metal-on-metal squeak, the sound of someone pushing back an entire row's armrest and seatback mechanism. The sound meant the person was preparing to stand up. I abandoned strategy. I broke into a full sprint, running down the corridor past the projection booth stairs, heading toward the lobby. I slammed the panic bar on the nearest emergency exit door, burst out into the night air, and didn't slow down until I reached the locked staff parking lot. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock my car, the adrenaline making my coordination non-existent. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. I looked back at the cinema building, a massive dark structure looming over the empty lot. Then I saw the light. The sound of a foot kicking something on the carpet. I heard the sound of the chair. It was a subtle metal-on-metal squeak, the sound of someone pushing back an entire row's armrest and seatback mechanism. The sound meant the person was preparing to stand up. I abandoned strategy. I broke into a full sprint, running down the corridor past the projection booth stairs, heading toward the lobby. The white light was so bright it cast a faint, almost spectral glow over the glass of the theater's front doors. And then a figure appeared silhouetted against the pure white screen inside. It was the audience member, the smoker. They were standing directly in the center of the auditorium, at the very bottom, right next to the screen. The projection light was so strong that it rendered the person completely black, a perfect, imposing silhouette. They were looking directly at me through the emergency exit door window and across the parking lot. Slowly, deliberately, the figure raised both hands. Not in a threat, but in a strange ceremonial gesture. The shadow hands framed the figure's head like they were cupping a pair of binoculars or holding a giant invisible pair of headphones. The movement was eerily reminiscent of an old-school projectionist, hands up checking the light focus or the audio levels before the reel begins. They were performing a silent final check. I finally found the resolve to hit the gas, flooring it out of the lot. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my mind already rehearsing the impossible story. The old ticket, the fresh popcorn, the locked projection booth, the 3-second video delay, and the man silhouetted against the white screen. An hour later, the investigating officer, an older, tired-looking woman, returned. She looked at me with an expression that was halfway between pity and confusion. "We checked the entire megaplex," she said, resting her pad on the desk. No sign of forced entry. The lock on the projection booth for Theater 5 was completely functional. It was locked from the outside when we got there. The master key opened it right up. Nothing was disturbed inside. "What about the security feed? The delay?" I asked, my voice barely a croak. The security company came out. They checked the DVR. All feeds are running on the same time clock. No delay registered in the system logs. It was running perfectly. "Maybe a temporary network error you saw." "And the screen? Was the screen in Theater 5 on?" The officer sighed. "No, sir. Every theater screen was off. All projectors were cool. The maintenance crew said they were all powered down and covered per procedure." My physical evidence, the terror I had witnessed, was now reduced to hallucination, paranoia, and a faulty memory. Then I remembered the ticket. I fumbled in my pocket and pulled out the old brittle cardstock stub, Shadow Play, 1987, Theater 5. What about this? I found this in the cup holder. It's evidence that someone was there. The officer took the ticket, turning it over in her hand. Sir, this is interesting, but it's not illegal. It's an old ticket stub. Could have been wed. She hesitated, then leaned in, slightly lowering her voice. The truth is, we did find something else in Theater 5. Something very strange. The cleaning crew did miss a spot. What was it? We found an open film canister on the stage, right in front of the screen. It was empty. But what's weird is the canister was the really old type, the metal kind, not the plastic ones they use for film prints nowadays. It was labeled, though. It said Northgate Rehearsal Reel, the projectionist's ghost light. She tapped her pen on her notebook. The maintenance manager told us about an incident here decades ago, before the place was a megaplex. A young projectionist, a real fanatic about his work, was crushed when a faulty lift broke in the middle of a late-night show in that exact theater. They say he was obsessed with the perfect frame. He supposedly died holding his favorite film reel. She paused, then shrugged. I don't know what you saw, sir, but sometimes people see what they're afraid of. I left the police station and drove home. I knew the truth was far more terrifying than a ghost story. The ticket was a marker. The fresh popcorn was a detail. The 3-second delay was a manipulation. The white screen and the silhouette were the final deliberate staging of a scene. The man wasn't the dead projectionist. He was a performance artist, a master manipulator who had studied the history of the theater, tampered with the equipment, and staged a perfect sequence of psychological horror for an audience of one me. And in the end, he succeeded. He didn't just scare me, he made me doubt my reality. He created an incident that was simultaneously true and unverifiable, trapping me in the narrative of a ghost story I could never prove. He had performed his final check, framed the perfect shot, and now he was gone, leaving me as the only remaining reel running on a loop of persistent, haunting fear. In late fall of 2021, I was working as a relief manager at a newer movie theater chain called Cinegold. It wasn't the old creaking theater from my past, a place known for shadows and strange stories whispered by employees during closing shifts. Cinegold was bright, modern, and sterile, a place that smelled like butter, substitute, and disinfectant. No ghosts, no weird memories. At least that's what I thought. It was a Sunday afternoon shift, the kind of slow, sleepy day we jokingly called the matinee lullaby. Families with toddlers, older couples seeking peace, and awkward film fanatics who preferred empty auditoriums. My friend Michael was managing concessions, and our newest hire, Maya, was stuck in the ticket booth. Michael was a skeptic of literally everything. Maya was the opposite. She reacted to small problems, like they were fatal omens. I handled everything in between, doing rounds, resolving issues, checking theaters, and trying to avoid thinking about work horror stories from my previous job. Around 1:30 p.m., I headed into Theater 3 to do a standard check. It was showing some animated kids movie, the kind with loud colors, louder jokes, and an audience full of sugar-drunk children. The auditorium was maybe a third full, and the air carried the faint smell of juice pouches and popcorn kernels crushed into the carpet. I walked down the aisle scanning the rows when one person caught my eye, a woman. She was sitting alone dead center in the auditorium. She looked to be in her late 60s, gray hair neatly styled, a lavender blouse buttoned up to the collar. Nothing unusual except for her posture. She was sitting bolt upright in the leather recliner, hands clasped tight in her lap, head angled downward instead of toward the screen. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't watching the movie. She looked like she was waiting for someone to speak to her. I thought nothing of it at first. People zone out all the time. But as I passed her row, something stopped me. A humming sound. Soft at first, almost layered beneath the movie's soundtrack. A slow, repetitive tune. No words, just a constant low lullaby. The kind that sounds innocent at first, but feels wrong when heard somewhere it doesn't belong. I pretended to check the floor for trash, getting a little closer. The humming grew slightly louder, as if she knew I was listening, and adjusted her volume deliberately. My skin prickled. I cleared my throat, putting on the professional tone I used when telling people to stop sneaking snacks into the theater. "Excuse me, ma'am, could you please keep it down? We've had a noise complaint." She stopped humming immediately, but she didn't look up, didn't adjust her posture. Her hands didn't loosen. Her breathing didn't change. "Apologies," she whispered, her voice dry as paper. I nodded awkwardly and continued my sweep. The humming didn't resume. Still, something about her silence felt orchestrated, like she had switched it off the moment I asked. Not startled, not embarrassed, just paused. About 45 minutes later, my radio crackled. "Michael, hey, can you check Theater 3 again? A lady just came out screaming that someone's singing a dead song to her children." I felt a cold heaviness tighten in my chest. The lavender lady. I headed back fast. The moment I entered, I heard the shift in the room. Kids whining, parents whispering, someone furiously tapping their phone screen. I found the upset mother, 2 kids both shaken, one on the edge of tears. "What seems to be the issue, ma'am?" She pointed an accusatory finger toward the center seats. "Her. She's been humming the creepiest tune I've ever heard. For 30 minutes. My youngest started crying. When I asked her to stop, she didn't. She got louder. I looked toward the lavender lady. There she was. Same seat, same posture, hands still in her lap, and the humming had returned. Only now I could hear it clearly, slow, methodical, unsettling in a way I couldn't describe. It didn't belong in a children's movie. It didn't belong anywhere. I approached her again. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to stop humming. You're disturbing other guests." She stopped instantly. Then, with painfully deliberate slowness, she lifted her head. Her eyes were pale, almost white, like frost covering a blue window. She didn't look at my face. She stared at my chest, as if she couldn't or wouldn't see me properly. Then she spoke. "The contract," she said quietly, "is only between the audience and the screen, not the audience and the floor." I blinked. "I don't understand." "What contract?" Her pale eyes lifted, and she smiled. A thin, lifeless smile. The kind someone makes not because they're amused, but because they've already won something you didn't know you were competing for. "The screen is the distraction," she whispered. "The lullaby is the truth. The screen tells fantasy. The lullaby tells the children the story of the room." I stepped back. This wasn't a typical disturbance anymore. This was something else, something that felt older, heavier, and entirely out of place in a family theater. "Ma'am, you need to leave. Now. Otherwise, we'll have to involve security." She didn't argue, didn't sigh, didn't even react emotionally. She simply picked up a small black purse from the seat beside her and stood, her posture still stiff, her movements puppet-like. I watched her walk down the aisle, each step measured and unnatural. She reached the exit, paused, and spoke without turning. "Check the floor." Then she stepped out. I followed her out into the hallway, 3 seconds behind her. She was gone. The hallway was empty, long, silent. No doors opening, no footsteps, just empty. Michael radioed again. No older woman came through the lobby. "You sure you're not missing her?" But I wasn't missing anything. She had disappeared. I went back into Theater 3 shaken. I checked the floor beneath her seat. Something metallic touched my fingertips. A brass music box key. And around her seat, under the surrounding rows, were faint indentations. Small marks pressed into the carpet. Slow, rhythmic patterns, like invisible fingers tapping a lullaby into the fibers of the floor. The lullaby she had been humming, and in the cup holder, beside her seat, was a folded child's drawing, a stick figure family, a screen, and a single giant eye in the foreground. Below it, in thick crayon letters, "Contract." Michael insisted the drawing was nothing more than a kid's forgotten doodle. Maya insisted it was a haunting. I stood somewhere between them, unsettled, unable to rationalize what I had just seen, and yet too grounded in my job to let panic win. I locked the music box key and the child's drawing in my office drawer. Part of me wished I'd thrown them away, but something, curiosity, dread, a sense of obligation, made me hold on to them. 2 days later, I had the closing shift. Quiet, Tuesday. Empty hallways. Maya was finishing up in concessions, humming nervously as she wiped down the glass display. Michael had already gone home. I dreaded what came next, the final walkthrough. Especially Theater 3. The auditorium was empty, at least, that's what I hoped. I pushed the door open slowly, letting the beam of my flashlight sweep across the seats. My breath fogged for a brief second, strangely cold in the room, but I pushed the sensation aside. The theater was silent. No humming. No crying kids. No rigid woman in lavender. Still, I felt watched. I made my way down the aisle. The floor no longer had the faint tap marks I'd seen before. The cup holder was empty. Everything looked normal. But normal never felt more wrong. I stepped onto the small stage in front of the screen to check the emergency exit as protocol required. The door was locked, push bar secure. I exhaled and turned back. My flashlight swept across the massive white screen. and froze. There, right in the center, were 5 shallow indentations, barely visible unless lit at the perfect angle. The marks were small, evenly spaced. 5 fingertips, pressed into the fabric of the screen. A handprint, a rhythm, a continuation of that humming pattern. My scalp prickled. The air felt heavier. I reached out and touched the screen gently. The indentations were real. Not dirt, not shadows. Something had physically pressed into the screen with precision. And then I noticed something pinned just above the handprints held in place by a tiny rusted tack, a piece of paper. I climbed onto a short equipment box to reach it, my heart rattling like loose popcorn kernels in a machine. It was a ticket stub. Not cine gold. Not modern. Old, thick cardstock, cream-colored, with elegant lettering. The title printed at the top, The Matinee Lullaby. The date was for the upcoming Sunday afternoon, 5 days from now. Same time slot, same auditorium. Seat number S1. My stomach flipped. Seat S1 didn't refer to standard auditorium seating. The only place with that label was the single stool on the stage used during Q&A sessions, speeches, or special screenings. A seat directly between the audience and the screen. And then I saw the detail that made every muscle in my body lock up. There was a tiny circular hole punched through the center of the ticket. Perfectly round. Perfectly placed. The exact size of the brass music box key sitting in my office drawer. My knees nearly gave out. This wasn't random. This wasn't a confused elderly woman humming in the wrong theater. This was deliberate. This was a setup. My breathing quickened. I felt the air shift around me thicker, like someone else was in the room. Then the auditorium door opened. A soft, echoing chime. Lobby entrance bell. Someone had entered the building. It was nearly midnight. Only employees had access now. I backed off the stage, slipping the ticket into my pocket, and hurried into the hallway. Maya, I called. No response. I checked concessions. Her cleaning rag lay on the counter, still damp. But she was gone. The soda machines hummed quietly. Popcorn warmers clicked. But the entire lobby felt abandoned. And wrong. I scanned the parking lot through the glass doors. Empty. Silent. Not a single car remained, not even Maya's. I was alone. Or at least I was supposed to be. As I turned away from the doors, something flickered in the glass reflection. I froze. In the reflection down the corridor behind me, leading back to Theater 3, someone was standing at the far end. Not the lavender lady. A tall, thin figure, unmoving, silhouetted in darkness. His hands were raised halfway to his face, cupping his ears, listening the same way she had been humming. Listening for the lullaby, listening for me. The figure leaned forward slightly, as if he were trying to hear my breath. I spun around. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The darkness swallowed everything beyond the first few feet. But he was there in the reflection, clear as anything. My pulse hammered in my eardrums. The contract. I remembered her words. The contract is only between the audience and the screen. The lullaby tells the children the story of the room. The lullaby wasn't simply sound. It was presence. It was pattern, carved into carpets, pressed into the screen, left behind like fingerprints on the air. And I had interrupted it. I had taken the key. I had taken the drawing. I had picked up the ticket stub meant for the next audience. The contract had shifted. To me, lights flickered overhead. A soft humming began down the dark hallway, slow, rhythmic, painfully familiar. A lullaby that scraped the inside of my skull as I backed away. I whispered, no, 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 no. The humming grew louder. The figure, still visible only in the reflection, stepped forward. One slow step, then another. A tall shadow with no face, no features, just a stretched silhouette moving toward me at a pace too calm to be human. I stumbled backward into the lobby, heart thundering, ready to bolt. But as I reached for the door, the humming stopped. Silence. The reflection showed only the empty hallway now. But the feeling remained. A presence lingering at the border of sight. He wasn't gone. He had moved somewhere else in the building. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere the lullaby could continue. I didn't wait to find out where. I left. Ran to my car. Locked the doors. Didn't breathe until I was halfway down the street. I never returned to Cine Gold. I quit the next morning. But the key, the ticket, the drawing, I still have them. I've tried to throw them away 3 times. They always reappear in places they shouldn't be, inside coat pockets next to my bed, once even inside my bathroom drawer. And late at night, sometimes I hear humming, quiet, rhythmic, patient, like someone standing just outside the boundary of my hearing, waiting to see whether I'll listen, waiting for the next showing, waiting for me to take seat S1. The contract is still running, and now I'm part of it.